This is the Plant Yourself podcast. I'm Howard Jacobson of plantyourself.com. One of the hot topics in health right now is the microbiome. You know, all those tiny little critters that live in us and on us, and it turns out play a huge role in keeping us healthy or not. And it's a fascinating new field of study. And of course, there's a lot of nonsense going along with it around how we have to feed our microbiome and give them bone broth and all sorts of stuff. And the science is really developing apace, but there's a lot of nonsense as well. So I wanted to get to the bottom of what the science really says right now about our microbiome, about how we keep it healthy, and what we know about it so far. So, of course, I turned to Dr. Milton Mills. He's a repeat guest on the podcast. He knows more about just about everything than anybody else I know. I can kind of, throw a dart at a topic and call Milton on it, and he would be erudite and exhaustive. And of course, this is kind of his wheelhouse. I heard him give a talk on the microbiome at the Peapod conference in Raleigh in May, and I was kind of blown away, but I was standing in the back and I couldn't hear too well, and I couldn't really take notes. So I kind of wanted him to tell it to me all over again. And so this time you get to listen in. So without further ado, Dr. Milton Mills, welcome back to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Happy to be back.
Yeah, so you gave a talk a couple months ago that I attended on the microbiome, and I was sitting in the back and I was scribbling notes, but unfortunately my handwriting sucks, so I don't remember what you said, but I remember that I was just being blown away by what we now know about the microbiome and what we can do about it. So
Sure.
So I'd love to just pick your brain and kind of introduce other people to the same sense of awe and wonder that I felt while listening to you kind of dive into this very, scientific and still pretty esoteric topic.
Right. Well, as you sort of alluded to, we, and by we, I mean just human beings in general, are still learning about our quote-unquote microbiome. So first, let's just start off by kind of defining what that refers to. The microbiome refers to the complex and diverse population of bacteria that live in our colons. And it strikes me that I need to just back up just even a little bit more to help people understand how our bodies work, because I think most people, when they think about human digestion, have a basic idea that, we eat a meal, it goes into our stomach where it's sort of, turned into a liquid, and then it passes into the small intestine where we absorb nutrients, and then we eventually get rid of everything that's left over. But that's really not how things work, and it's certainly not how they're supposed to work. And what I mean by that is that there are three major organs of digestion. There's the stomach, of course, and the small intestine, but then there's also our large intestine. And for human beings, the large intestine is a very large organ that does or should be doing a lot for us.
Now, what I learned in biology in the 1980s, the last time I studied it seriously, was that the large intestine was basically like the waste product system. That's where everything that we don't need kind of goes out, and then the water gets up, reuptaken, and everything else is just sort of shooted on its way down to the rectum and out into the wide world, and there's nothing very interesting going on there.
Yeah, and that's actually not true, and that's not the way things work, or and certainly not the way they're supposed to work. I started off the lecture that you were referring to talking about the concept of food retention time, if you recall.
Yep.
And And that refers to the amount of time a meal actually stays within our body before, between the time we eat it and the time we eliminate whatever's left over. And whenever I start off talking about food retention time, one of the first things people kind of say is that, well, how do I know how long a particular meal stays in my body? Because everything that comes out looks pretty much the same. And so I rather glibly tell people that the next time they eat whole kernel corn, to just note what time they eat it, and then note what time they see it again. And typically, if a person is eating a good, healthy, plant-based diet, a meal will stay in our bodies an average of 16 hours, sometimes depending. If you eat like a lot of really high-fiber raw food, it can pass through in as little as 12 hours, but typically it's about, we'll say, 16 hours. Well, what's interesting and important about that is that a meal stays in our stomach about 2 hours or less. And then it passes into the small intestine, and in humans, the small intestine averages 30 to 35 feet in length. And it actually passes through the entire length of the small intestine in 2 hours or less. So if you're starting off with a time frame of 16 hours, we've only accounted for 4 hours, excuse me. And that means that for the remainder of that time, food is in the colon. And the reason it is in the colon for such an extended period of time is not that it's just supposed to be sitting there, but there's a population of bacteria in the colon that can actually act on plant fiber and break it down into a number of different compounds and even neurotransmitters that have very, very beneficial effects on our health and physiology. And so the microbiome refers to, as I said, that population of bacteria in our colon, but the makeup of the bacterial population is heavily influenced by the types of foods that we eat. And one of the reasons that people have been slow to discover just how important the impact of the microbiome can be on our physiology is because for a very long time, people simply were not eating the right kinds of high-fiber foods and therefore didn't have the full effect or benefits of our microbiome. So because people for so long were eating, primarily or largely animal food-based diets that simply didn't have enough plant fiber in them, number one, those diets that are heavily focused on animal foods tend to cause us to have a bacterial population that actually resembles the type of bacteria found in the colons of meat-eating animals, carnivorous animals. And the issue with that is that those types of bacteria are not very good or very efficient at breaking down plant fiber. And their actions are more putrefactive as opposed to fermentation. Now, what does fermentation refer to? Well, again, as we discussed in the lecture, plant fibers are made up of cellulose. And cellulose compounds called lignins, and you have a range of different types of fibers, what are called water-soluble fibers. These are cellulose plant fibers that dissolve in water but are not absorbed into our bodies as such. And then you have the more traditional types of plant fibers, which are the insoluble bran and celluloses and hemicelluloses that we are very familiar with.
And those are basically like instead of plants having bones, They had the insoluble fiber, right, for structure.
Correct. Because, you know, as you alluded to, plants don't have bones. And so the way that they stiffen their tissues and resist gravity is that every plant cell is surrounded by a cell wall. And that cell wall is made up of cellulose and other indigestible fibers. And while we mammals don't make enzymes that can break down cellulose, bacteria do. And so that's why animals that eat high fiber diets have come up with two different approaches to digesting plant fiber. There are the ruminants like cows and antelope and animals of that nature that are what are called foregut fermenters. And what that means is that they have in their first stomach, and this is why they have multiple stomachs. In the first stomach, they have a population of bacteria that release enzymes that will digest cellulose. And so what a cow does, for instance, is it will go and basically scoop up a stomach full of hay or grass, swallow it, let it soak up those bacterial enzymes, and then it brings it back up and chews that food to mix it with those bacterial enzymes. And that's what chewing the cud is all about. It's about mixing the grass with the bacterial enzymes so the process of digestion can take place. Then when it swallows the food, again, it goes into a separate stomach where the grass is broken down, and then it passes into their small intestine where it's the nutrients are absorbed. And this process of foregut fermentation that you find in the ruminants is actually a very efficient process, and that's why if you see a fresh cow patty or the stool from a cow or another ruminant, it's liquid because they're able to break down most of the fiber in the food that they eat. But other plant eaters like horses and rabbits and primates like we humans, we are what's called hindgut fermenters. And that's because we typically eat plant foods that have a lot more nutrient value. So we eat things like carrots and grains and legumes, foods that have a very high nutrient content, and it would be inefficient to try and ferment those foods initially because the bacteria would use up most of the energy in the food. So instead, we ingest a meal, we liquefy it in the stomach, pass it into the small intestine, and absorb all of the readily available nutrients, and then the leftover plant fiber goes into the colon, where the bacteria in the colon then start fermenting those the leftover fiber, and they break it down into a number of different compounds that can be absorbed. And these part of these compounds are called short chain fatty acids, and there's a number of different short chain fatty acids, and we can talk about what they do for our physiology. But they also convert some of those fibers into actual neurotransmitters that are absorbed and can then go to the brain and influence our mood and the way that we actually think. Other compounds are made that actually stimulate and boost our immune function and help reduce our risk of developing infections and cancers and so forth. There are important antioxidant compounds that help reduce the overall level of inflammation in our bodies. And they also modify a number of compounds called phytoestrogens and lignans, which help block things like breast cancer, or reduce the risk for breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. So the actions of the bacteria in our colons are they're just amazing, and they're varied, and they have a really profound effect on our physiology.
So
Now,
can I interrupt for a second just for a question? So you said it took us a long time to figure this out, basically because everybody Western medicine was studying was eating a high animal foods kind of low fiber diet. So
correct.
So can you do you know how we started discovering this? Did we start looking at like, rural villagers in southern Africa, or did we suddenly get a huge population of whole food plant-based eaters? Like how did this come about? This
Sure.
incredible revolution in understanding how we do the most basic thing we do, which is eat.
Right. Well, one of the biggest clues was that researchers noticed that there were marked differences in disease risk between populations in Western countries where we typically consume a diet that's very heavily, very high in animal foods versus less developed countries, or what are referred to as less developed countries, where people eat a primarily plant-based diet. And what became instantly clear was that the risk for the major cancers that we see in Western countries, such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, and even pancreatic and other cancers like leukemias and in children, brain cancers and so forth, that in countries where people typically eat a plant-based diet and a diet that is low in animal foods, they have a much lower risk for developing these types of cancers. And even within the United States, there are these longitudinal studies that have looked at Seventh-day Adventists, who Seventh-day Adventists is a Protestant denomination where the church encourages its members to become vegetarian or vegan. And as a result, approximately half of the members of that denomination are either vegetarian or vegan. And again, when researchers looked at Seventh-day Adventists, they found that the vegetarians and vegans, again, had much lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, cancers, and so forth. And so it became fairly obvious that the important variable was what they were eating, and the fact that they had, one, eliminated animal foods from their diet, but also, equally importantly, that they were eating a high fiber plant-based diet. And so that's what kind of clued people into the importance of plant fibers in our overall health.
Right.
And
Although like Dennis Burkitt was writing about fiber right in the 60s and 70s, but his basic
and even earlier than that, you're absolutely right.
But his view was that like fiber's like a broom, right? Which is what I learned. That it's like this idea of like so much incredible stuff happens in the colon, and it happens in such sort of efficient and elegant and almost miraculous ways.
Correct.
That there are. I've heard people say like we have a second brain in our gut.
And in some ways that's I understand why people say that, because as I alluded to before, the bacteria actually manufacture a number of bioactive neurotransmitters that affect, not only how we think, but our overall mood, and lowers the risk for things like depression and anxiety disorders. There's even evidence that it can help to ameliorate symptoms of schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders. But you're absolutely right that the earliest researchers that noticed that people who consumed high-fiber diets were at lower risk for, say, colon cancer and breast cancer and so forth, their assumption was that the primary effect of the fiber was, as you said, sort of like a biological broom, meaning that it would sweep the colon clean and dilute any toxic compounds and help remove things like cholesterol and other potentially toxic substances from our bodies, and that was the way in which it reduced disease risk. And there's no question that diets that are high in fiber actually improve transit times through the large intestine and can help get rid of potentially toxic compounds. But as people began to really study the interaction between bacteria and fiber and all of the things that the bacteria were doing, it became clear that the effect of the fiber went far beyond this sort of, biological broom effect, to just use that expression, but that they were actually creating a number of really important compounds that changed our physiology in very beneficial ways. And the one thing I want to allude to before we go too far is there's even research now that's being done in infants that is showing that in mothers who eat high fiber diets, that they pass along to their babies and infants a bacterial population that actually reduces the risk for behavioral problems, mood disorders, and so forth. And I just want to say at the outset that I am not an expert in sort of the pediatric aspects of the microbiome, and a lot of that research is in its infancy, no pun intended. But that I just wanted to be clear to people that the benefits of being plant-based start from the very beginning. And as we discover and learn more about how the bodies of infants and toddlers interact with the fiber in their diets, we will get a deeper understanding of that. But with respect to adults, for instance, I alluded to these breakdown products of fiber called short-chain fatty acids. And there are four principal short-chain fatty acids that are produced when the bacteria in our colons ferment or break down fiber. The first is a 4-carbon compound that's called butyrate. And it turns out that the cells that line the colon, that make up the mucosa or barrier in the colon, most of the cells in our body prefer to extract their energy from our bloodstream. So, we eat food, we break it down into various forms of energy, and it's absorbed into the bloodstream, and then cells will pull out that energy from the bloodstream and use it to do all of the things that they do. Well, it turns out that the cells that make up the colon prefer to extract their energy from the breakdown products of fiber fermentation, and that, in fact, colonic cells prefer to use butyrate, or the 4-carbon short-chain fatty acid produced by the bacteria in the colon, as their primary energy source. Well, why is that important? It's important because when we have high levels of butyrate in the colon, then the cells that actually make up the colonic mucosa are very healthy. They bond, they hold on to each other very tightly, and they can prevent bacteria and inflammatory toxins and bacterial compounds from being absorbed from the colon into our bloodstream. But when, in fact, there is not enough butyrate, then those cells cannot sort of bond to each other very tightly, and you get what's called leaky gut syndrome. So instead of the cells holding on to each other very tightly, like, say, bricks in a brick wall, the grout between the individual cells or bricks becomes porous and defective, and then bacteria and bacterial compound can actually squeeze in between those cells, get into our bloodstream. where they increase inflammation. They can actually cause actual disease, such as bacterial infections, and also protein residues from the food that we eat can also get absorbed, where our immune system will recognize them as foreign compounds and make antibodies against these foreign proteins that can sometimes cross-react with the proteins in our own tissues and cause what are called autoimmune diseases. So that's just one way in which the fermentation products can really improve our physiology.
So
it also turns.
So for that autoimmune reaction, a lot of people, say they're allergic to some food. It's very often like a plant food, right? So the people blame the plant food, like I have a soy allergy or I can't have gluten or something like that.
Right.
You say that it may be that like the protein from that food may have been the thing that got triggered, but it's not the plant's fault in the first place, right? There's a higher level etiology.
Not at all. And I want to separate out the gluten allergy from some of these other putative allergies that people have. One of the fundamental points I want to make is that things like gluten allergy, peanut allergies, and so forth are more common in Western countries than they are in, again, so-called less developed societies. And what medical researchers are discovering is that part of the problem is that in Western countries, because women don't like to breastfeed or because they are trying to work at the same time they're raising a family, they tend to not breastfeed long enough, and they start introducing solid food to their babies and infants really before they should. And that is a problem because babies are born with immature digestive systems. And what I mean by that is that a human adult has 5 different protein digesting enzymes, which allow us to basically break any protein we ingest down into its individual amino acids. Well, because babies are supposed to passively absorb antibodies, which are proteins, from their mothers, infants only have 2 or 3 out of the full complement of protein digesting enzymes, and that's so that they cannot break down their mother's antibodies, but they absorb those antibodies intact. And that's fine as long as an infant is only taking in breast milk during its first year of life. But what happens when people start to feed these babies either cereals or even cow's milk is that the infants absorb large protein fragments from the cereals, and it can be gluten proteins that their immune system recognizes as a foreign protein and can make antibodies against it that can then actually result in a gluten allergy. Or even more ominously, in the case of the proteins that are found in cow's milk, they break bovine serum albumin down into protein fragments that are then absorbed. Antibodies are made against those cow milk proteins that can actually cross-react with insulin-producing cells in the pancreas, and they kill those insulin-producing cells, and the child will go on to develop what's called type 1 or early onset diabetes, and which is an autoimmune disease where they no longer make any insulin. And that's one of the reasons that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children are not exposed to cow's milk until they are more than a year old. I personally would recommend that they not be exposed to cow's milk at all because it's a foreign substance that we do not need. But so I just want to make the point that some of the allergies or food allergies that we see in Western countries are because we simply don't breastfeed our infants as long as we should. And if we did, that the incidence of these allergies would go way down.
Right. So there's.
Said that,
can I jump in again?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it's I'm fascinated by the science, and I hope listeners are as well. But I also want to keep jump back to kind of bigger themes.
Sure.
Which it sounds like these little critters, these bacteria that we have sort of co-evolved with to exist healthily.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're what's striking me is, first of all, how crucial they are, even though we didn't know it until recently, and how vulnerable. And it's almost like it's almost a little bit scary. Like everything has to be right for us to be okay. We can't just pick and choose. So it's like when I look at it, it's like this amazing design. It's like we're in an orchestra playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and we decide we can just take out every fourth measure, and I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah, and that's not the case. No, I mean you're absolutely right that it's a sense. We need the full complement of the bacteria that are supposed to populate our colon in order to be in optimal health. But the thing that I want people to understand is that this is not hard to accomplish, because if we're eating a very high fiber plant-based diet, you will take in all of the compounds you need to have that healthy bacterial population. A lot of people think that they have to constantly take these probiotics. That is really a bunch of nonsense. And in fact, studies have shown that when people ingest probiotics in the absence of a disease state, the bacteria that they ingest don't hang around for very long at all. And that what's more important for having a healthy bacterial population are not probiotics, but what are called prebiotics. And what are the prebiotics? They are healthy, whole food, plant-based fibers. So it's the fiber that you get from eating whole plant foods.
Yeah, I was talking with Dr. Pam Popper about this, because I'd read a whole bunch of studies saying, probiotics don't really help. And and she was pointing out they don't. Like if you give people and she's a big believer in taking them, but in the kind of reductionist model of research that we do, you just give people probiotics, and you don't. Of course, you can't change their diet because that would be a confounding variable, and it's like. You bring a whole bunch of ladybugs and put them in your garden, but there's nothing for them to eat, and they fly away, and you go, well,
exactly.
I guess ladybugs don't help.
Yeah, I mean, and that's actually a fairly good analogy, and because if you take in probiotics but you aren't giving the bacteria what they need to survive, they're not going to stick around. They're basically going to die off and be eliminated from the body. And that's why prebiotics or the plant fibers are so important, because what we know is that when you have a diet that is made up of a wide variety of plant fibers, that will actually selectively promote the growth of beneficial bacteria. And that those bacteria will then hang around and populate the colon. I guess one way you can think of it is that if you had a zoo, and I'm not in any way advocating the zoos, I'm just using this as an example, where you had a bunch of carnivores and a bunch of herbivores, and you selectively fed all of the animals meat, the plant eaters would die off, and the meat eaters would survive. But if you then turned around and start feeding them nothing but plant foods, the meat eaters would die off, and the plant eaters would survive. And it's the same way in our colons. When we have a diet that has a lot of plant fiber in it, it promotes the growth and establishment of the healthy bacteria that actually can ferment fiber and produce these very healthy, beneficial compounds that we've been talking about.
Great. Can you say a little bit more about the link between the microbiome health and mood and mental health?
Sure. Well, again, our understanding of this interaction is again still in its relative infancy, meaning that we're just beginning to appreciate how important this is. But there are a number of different ways in which bacteria affect our mental health. Number one, as I said, the bacteria manufacture a number of important antioxidant compounds that help reduce inflammation in the body. Furthermore, by promoting healthy populations of bacteria, you essentially eliminate the unhealthy types of bacteria that create toxic compounds that upregulate inflammation. It turns out that plant fibers, as I said, bacteria can use these plant fibers for their energy, and in the process of using them for energy, they break the plant fibers down into these beneficial compounds, as I discussed, called short-chain fatty acids. Well, if you're eating a diet that is primarily made up of animal foods, and animal foods, as we know, have no fiber in them, you end up with a colon that is full of basically leftover protein residues. And protein residues cannot be fermented. They can only be they rot, they putrefy.
So what does that mean when you say it putrefies or rots? What's the difference between that and fermentation?
Well, again, fermentation, you have a long chain of plant fiber that the bacteria alter in ways that they can extract energy from, but then they create these things called short-chain fatty acids, which our bodies can then absorb and actually utilize for energy, and they affect our physiology, as I said, in beneficial ways. They also can modify these plant phyto compounds into neurotransmitters that can then be absorbed and help our brains function better. But protein residue cannot be converted into anything other than a toxic compound. Like they have names like putrescine and cadaverine, and it's the things that if you've ever and most of us have smelled a dead body or a dead animal, it has a very foul odor, and that's because of these toxins that are created when protein residues are acted on by bacteria. It's kind of difficult to explain without going into very complicated the biochemistry of it. But the bottom line is that protein residues cannot be converted into short-chain fatty acids. They are rotted in ways or chemically changed in ways that they create toxins, not anything beneficial. I mean, that's the simplest way to explain it. And it turns out that studies have shown that when people have diets that are high in animal proteins, that when bacteria act on those protein residues, they create a number of toxic compounds like cresol and, as I said, cadaverine and putrescine. And when these things are absorbed, they actually negatively affect our mental functioning, and they increase the risk for depression and anxiety. But even more importantly, the compound cresol actually interferes with the ability of nerve cells to make a compound called myelin. And we know that myelin is the insulation that wraps around the axons of cells in our central nervous system and help them function normally. And you can think of the myelin as the rubber insulation that you see on any electrical cord. And you know that if you go through and you scrape off the insulation on an extension cord or the plug that plugs into your TV or toaster, that if that insulation is gone, it will start to spark. The appliance will not work properly because the electrical signals cannot travel up and down that cord in an efficient fashion. And something very similar happens in the brain and the central nervous system when the myelin sheath is interrupted because we are eating foods that create toxins as opposed to help create a healthy central nervous system. And I realize that that's a simplified explanation, but the biochemistry gets very complicated.
Right. Well, it kind of makes sense, from a sort of cause and effect perspective, I would think. So if you're a Paleolithic human and you're used to living on all these plants, and all of a sudden you start getting a lot of meat, and your body knows that's no good for you, like it would probably tell the brain, hey, let's slow this bugger down a little bit. Let's create a negative feedback loop so they're not so able to hunt, right? So maybe depress them a little bit so we can go back to fruits and berries, right?
Well, I actually don't think it's well, number one, I want people to understand that prior to the creation of modern hunting weapons, humans never ate a diet that was primarily animal foods, outside of people living in Arctic areas where they could kill these giant animals that would then basically not rot away because they're in a giant freezer. And throughout the vast majority of human history, we were eating a diet that was comprised primarily of plant foods. In fact, there are studies looking at what are called coprolites, or fossilized feces from Paleolithic peoples, and it shows that these people were eating tons of plant foods, not meat. So the phenomenon of humans eating large amounts of meat is actually very recent in human history. And what ends up happening is, when we do this, we end up absorbing a lot of as I said, from our colons, because we're not providing the right substrates for the bacteria there. We absorb a lot of toxic compounds, and it manifests itself in a variety of different diseases. But I also wanted to just kind of mention that studies have shown that the more inflammatory compounds that a person has in his or her body, the higher your risk of depression, but also of developing dementia, such as Alzheimer's and so forth. And again, we know that this is at least mediated in part by the higher levels of inflammation that people have when they don't get enough fiber, but it also is likely due to the fact that bacteria are not making the important neurotransmitters that our brains need. And then, as I said, the toxic compounds that are created interferes with the ability of the nerve cells to insulate themselves properly, and that will result in psychiatric diseases like depression and anxiety and so on. But I'd like to talk about short-chain fatty acids for a little bit more, because I talked about the 4-carbon short-chain fatty acid butyrate that is really important for the health of colonic cells. It's also been shown to modify the DNA in colon cells in ways that reduce the risk of developing colon cancer. Well, the next short-chain fatty acid...
Wait. Sorry, I got to stop you there. It modifies the DNA in our bodies. So this
Absolutely.
So these little critters that we invite, hopefully, to live in our bodies, produce compounds if we feed them right that changes our DNA and makes us more resistant to cancer.
Ways. Absolutely.
How does it do that?
Well,
I mean, I thought DNA doesn't change.
What are called epigenetic effects. In other words, they make compounds that attach to the proteins that actually surround our DNA, and they modify those proteins in ways that determine how the DNA genes are transcribed. People used to think that DNA was set in stone, but what people are now, again, we're understanding is that the DNA in our chromosomes are wrapped around these proteins called histone proteins. And it turns out that the histone proteins are what are modified by the foods that we eat. And that when you're eating a plant-based diet, it modifies those histone proteins in ways that will suppress cancer-causing genes, but upregulate beneficial genes that promote overall health. And a while ago, I mentioned the effect on the central nervous system cells that make the myelin, which insulate our neurons. Well, it turns out that the toxic compounds that are created by the putrefaction of animal protein residues actually modify the way the DNA in what are called oligodendrocytes, which are the myelin-producing cells in the central nervous system, that they turn off their ability to transcribe the genes which tell them to make myelin. So that's one of the ways that it interferes with the insulation of our central nervous system, and as a result, we end up with clinical psychiatric disease, as well as increasing our risk for ultimately going on to develop Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia.
Okay. So let me let you get back to the short chain fatty acids.
Right. So another really important short chain fatty acid is a 3-carbon short chain fatty acid called propionate. And the reason propionate is so amazing is that propionate actually is absorbed and travels to the liver, and it inhibits an enzyme called HMA-CoA reductase, HMG-CoA reductase. And the reason that enzyme is so important is that is the rate-limiting enzyme in the production of cholesterol.
So when you say rate limiting, what do you mean by that?
Meaning that it is the primary enzyme that governs cholesterol synthesis.
So it's like the part of the assembly line that no matter how fast everybody else is going, if that one goes slow or fast, that affects the production, the end product.
Exactly. And again, what's really important about that is that drugs like Lipitor and Zocor or statin drugs, that's the enzyme they target to decrease production of cholesterol. They all inhibit HMA-CoA reductase.
Wait, so HMA, what is it again?
It is, I'm sorry, HMG-CoA reductase. HMG-CoA reductase. That's the enzyme that Lipitor, Zocor, Crestor, Mevacor, all of those drugs target that enzyme and basically shut it down, and that's the way in which they reduce cholesterol in the body. Well, the problem is, as we know, all of these statin drugs don't only affect HMG-CoA reductase, they also affect other enzyme systems in our body and can create, muscle wasting and a number of other unpleasant side effects. Well, propionate inhibits HMG-CoA reductase and does not have those unpleasant negative side effects. We have other drugs such as Lopid and so forth that can reduce triglyceride levels in humans. Propionate also reduces triglyceride levels. And and propionate, and then we have, when it comes to diabetes, there's a drug called metformin, which reduces glucose production by the liver and helps to control blood sugar levels. Well, propionate also does the same thing. It decreases glucose production by the liver the same way metformin or glucophage does. So the point is that if we are eating a high-fiber diet, the bacteria in our colon will produce these natural compounds that can do the exact same thing that many of our drugs do without the negative side effects. And part of the reason that people need these drugs is that they are simply not eating the right foods.
Well, it's like, you've been to my house, you've seen my garden. It's like,
absolutely,
like walking through the garden and then slogging through the woods in order to make it to the grocery store to buy like kale. When I just walked through the garden, all I had to do was stop and pick it.
Right.
Like
absolutely.
so we when people need metformin or a statin, we don't need it. Our bodies are not
right foods. Right. We would likely not need these drugs, and that's why we see that when people change from a typical Western style meat heavy diet to let's say a vegan diet, which is comprised only of whole plant foods, that their cholesterol levels will drop by over 100 points. People have been able to cure their diabetes by becoming vegan. And again, it's because the beneficial effects of the fiber and other plant compounds help correct the physiologic derangements that we see in our bodies from eating the wrong types of food. So again, it's just so, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the interaction between the bacteria in our colons and the fiber and foods that we eat to help create overall health and promote overall health.
Uh-huh. Any other short chain fatty acids that you wanted to cover? Because those two are amazing.
Well, the other important one is a 2-carbon short chain fatty acid called acetate, and we know that acetate actually helps. Is used by our muscle cells instead of glucose, which means that the amount of glucose stored in our body lasts much longer, and that's important because our brains only use glucose for its metabolism. And it's thought that one of the means by which our body decides when it's hungry is by monitoring how much glucose we have on board. And if, in fact, our glucose stores are getting low, the body signals, hey, you have to go out and eat, because obviously the brain only wants glucose. But because too often what we are eating is a low-fiber, low-carbohydrate diet that is high in fat, we don't adequately replete our glucose stores. Furthermore, we don't have the fiber to create the acetate, which will allow our glucose stores to last longer. And as a result, we're basically constantly hungry because our body is constantly trying to get us to ingest more complex carbohydrate and more glucose so that our brains will be happy.
So the brain is sort of the rate-limiting factor for our desire for glucose.
Well, absolutely, because every day, 25% of the energy that your body burns up is used by the brain alone. And that's pretty amazing because the brain is only about 3% of your total body weight, but it uses 25% of the energy that you burn every day. That's how extremely metabolically active the brain is. And the brain uses exclusively glucose. So it's really important that we keep our glucose stores up, because if you've ever seen a person with diabetes whose blood sugar is too low, they become stuporous, they become confused, and if the if the glucose level falls low enough, they can actually have a stroke or go into a coma. So it's extremely important that our bodies keep our glucose levels within the normal range, and that's why when those levels start to fall, the brain signals, "Hey, it's time to go eat something." But again, if we were eating a whole food plant-based diet, not only would we have very high glucose stores, but our bodies would also be making a lot of these short-chain fatty acids that would keep us from becoming hungry.
Right.
And that's, again, another reason that people who eat plant-based diets tend to have fewer problems with obesity and so forth.
Right. So in the few minutes we have left, you've made a really strong case for the importance of eating plant-based, high-fiber foods. What if someone's listening to this and they've been eating differently? Like, is all we need to do is to switch? Because I know there's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about, like like antibiotics, both in our food supply and in the animal feed. So there's lots of ways in which we can mess up our microbiome. What's the prescription?
Well, it is really, really simple, Howard. It's simply deciding to eliminate animal foods from our diet. But I guess I do want to give one caveat, and that is that I've talked to people in the past that said, I tried to go plant-based, but I was hungry all the time. And so I asked them, well, what were you eating? And they say, I was eating a lot of salads and a lot of broccoli, and while those foods are very important and very necessary for us to eat, they are primarily water and fiber. We also need to be sure that we're eating things like legumes, which are beans, peas, lentils, and grains such as whole grain rice and whole grain wheat and barley and so forth. And then our root vegetables like yams and potatoes and so forth, because these are the plant foods that have enough calories and enough protein to keep our body well-fed and well-stocked with all the nutrients we need so that we aren't hungry and that we are very, very healthy. So I would just encourage, if there's someone out there, and I hope there will be, who realizes, I need to change my diet, that you would change to a whole food, plant-based diet, that you would make sure that you're eating your legumes and your grains on a regular basis, and that you're always having a source of fresh vegetables and raw salads and green leafy vegetables.
Gotcha. So but the critters aren't there, right? So we've been eating a lot of meat and we've taken a lot of antibiotics. Like how do they get there back to our stomachs, and how do we make sure we get the right ones?
Well, the interesting thing is that you will have some of the bacteria in your colon. It's just that they aren't the predominant species because they haven't been receiving the type of foods that they need to really multiply and become the predominant strains. But if you start consuming that whole food plant, high fiber diet, that is going to selectively promote the growth of the beneficial bacteria. Now, some people might say that, well, you can also take some healthy probiotics to help kind of get a healthy population established. And if someone is making a dietary change and they want to, temporarily take in some of the probiotics to help get that healthy population established, I think that that's fine. But you don't need to continually take these probiotics because, again, as you eat the high-fiber foods, that's going to promote the growth of the healthy bacteria.
Gotcha.
And as I said, personally, I don't really think that you need to even take the probiotics because just by eating the right types of foods and the healthy bacteria will be promoted, their growth will be promoted, and bacteria grow so fast it will be a matter of a few days and you will have the healthy bacteria in your colon. So it's really not that important to take probiotics.
Gotcha. So in closing, what's for you? You've been studying this for a long time. What's the most sort of surprising or amazing or awe-inspiring part of this whole field of medicine and biology to you?
Well, it's the one thing that became crystal clear to me is that, like you, Howard, when I was growing up, I was pretty much taught that our colon was just a place where stool was stored before we went to the bathroom and got rid of it. And what I've come to realize is that, no, in fact, our colon is an integral part of our physiology, and what goes on in our colon is not is absolutely essential for optimal health. That you cannot be truly healthy if you are not eating a whole food, plant-based diet that promotes the growth of the most beneficial bacteria, because these bacteria do all sorts of wonderful things that help stimulate our immune system, help our brains function better, and reduce the risk for all sorts of chronic diseases.
Right on. All right. Well, this is. I hope someone, you know, what I love talking to you is that there's so much sort of knowledge and authority that after hearing you talk, I'm like, well, duh, of course, this is the way things are. Like, there's a lot of people talking science but there's sort of a he said, she said, and then, you know, you can find people
Right.
who will say the opposite, but it's really hard to argue with you. I pity the paleo people who try.
Man.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, and I anticipate that many of your listeners are probably going to have a lot of questions about this, because obviously this topic is I mean, we could talk about this for hours. And, you know, if there are a number of important questions that come up, I'd be more than happy to come back and do a second session to address some of the questions that you may receive from your listeners.
Oh, that'd be awesome. I'll put that in the show notes. You heard it here. I'll mention it in the introduction, and we'll take comments right on this blog page. So people who are listening, what a great offer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's just again, it's just because there's so much to discuss, and it's such an important topic, and I want to be sure that people really understand just how important their colon is and their microbiome is for their health, and to really understand how it works and how it can benefit us. Awesome.
So now you don't really have a website, right?
No, not right now. I don't, because with work and all of the, you know, I am a practicing critical care physician. I just don't have the time to keep it up like it should. You know, I'd like to.
Right.
So no, I'm not doing that just yet.
All right. Yeah, I feel like I want to get offline and contact you and offer to put one up for you. But for right now, people can think of YouTube as your website. So if they do a search for Dr. Milton Mills,
videos on YouTube that I think people would find interesting and informative.
Right. And you're not a soundbite kind of guy. They're like hour-long lectures.
No, that's absolutely true. I tend to be very detailed.
Awesome. Well,
we used to drive my mother crazy.
Yeah. Well, and the nice thing about the YouTubes is that they have slides so people can actually see the names of things and slow it down. So I highly recommend those videos. If you're curious, if you're in doubt, and you're hearing Time magazine covers about butter and stuff, and you're like, yeah, I don't know what makes sense. Like Dr. Milton Mills makes sense. Go find him on YouTube. Share those, and the world will be a much happier and healthier place.
Yeah, and don't believe that garbage in oh my God, in Time magazine. That was some of the most misleading and deceptive science. That was the equivalent of the tobacco industry telling you that cigarettes don't cause cancer. That simply was not true.
Right. And And it's hard. It's hard for people to see that because they have to cut through layers of jargon.
Just a quick explanation of that?
Oh, sure.
Well, basically, what they did was they looked at people who were eating, say, around 50% fat in their diet and compared them to people who were eating 30% fat, and they did not see a difference in disease rates. And so they concluded that fat does not contribute to excess disease. Well, the problem was that they did not look at people who were eating a really low-fat diet. And so you can think of it this way. Normal air has 21% oxygen, okay? And if I put, say, a lab animal into a container that only had 5% oxygen, and I put another lab animal into a cage that had 10% oxygen, and both of them died, would I be justified in saying oxygen doesn't sustain life? No. It's clear that the problem was there wasn't enough oxygen in either cage. And so it's kind of the reverse with the studies that they did looking at fat. Both groups were eating way too much fat. To see a reduction in the disease risk as a function of dietary fat, you have to get the amount of fat people are eating down to less than 15 to 20%. When people drop below 15 to 20%, you see a marked reduction in cancers and heart disease risk, diabetes, and so forth. And so that was the problem with the studies that people were looking at in that article published in Time. Everybody was eating way more fat than they should have been eating.
All right. Well, that's a really clear, simple explanation. I've given long explanations on that, but I think it leaves people confused. If that's all you remember, like we're not looking at healthy reference ranges, so all bets are off.
Precisely.
All right. Well, Dr. Milton Mills, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm looking forward to our next podcast interview, which will not be published here, but so somewhere else on society and politics.
Yeah.
I'll just tease that, but it's not for the Plant Yourself podcast. But at some point we'll share it when we figure out where it's going to go, because you are a powerful and passionate thinker, and I love being challenged and educated by you. So again, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Howard, it's always a pleasure, man. Always. I wish we lived in the same city so we could hang out more.
Yeah, well, there's hospitals down here, so we could probably find you a job. All right. Take care.
All right, man. Listen, you have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.